Aldous Huxley, and these are the sounds of the brave new world, of test tube and decanter, of hissing injectors and gurgling blood substitutes. We are inside the London Hatchery and Conditioning Centre, and this is the fertilizing room, an enormous laboratory where the temperature is never allowed to fall below 98.6. And here comes the Director of Hatcheries and Conditioning in person.
Today, I just want to give you a general idea of things. These are the incubators, and here is the week's supply of ova, kept at blood heat. Now here, we immerse the eggs into a warm bouillon containing free-swimming spermatozoa. Immersion continues until the eggs are all fertilized. And over here is where we bottle the alphas and betas. In short, gentlemen, the perfect process for manufacturing healthy babies.
Here is a man who wrote, a book which wasn't just a bestseller for a few years, but has lasted right through the century. And you have to read it if you want to know not just about the 1930s, as if is going to be able to do, and how you might form your moral ideas concerning that. Then you must read this book. It's essential.
Reading Brave New World today, it's easy to see why Aldous Huxley is regarded by some as a prophet of the age. Though the book is set 6 centuries in the future, when Henry Ford, the pioneer of the production line, is God, humans are mass-produced, and emotions are controlled by drugs, it's the present the Brave New World so powerfully evokes.
She would tell him about the lovely music that came out of a box, and all the nice games you could play, and the delicious things to eat and drink, and the light that came when you pressed a little thing in the wall, and the pictures that you could hear and feel and smell as well as see, and the pink and green and blue and silver houses as high as mountains, and everybody happy, and no one ever sad or angry, and everyone belonging to everyone else, and the boxes where you could see and hear what was happening at the other side of the world, and babies in lovely, clean bottles. Everything so clean, and no nasty smells, no dirt at all. And people never lonely, but living together and being so jolly and happy. And the happiness being there every day. Every day.
I projected these things 500 or 600 years into the future, and it is rather alarming to find that only 27 years later, quite a number of these forecasts have already come true, and come true with a vengeance.
This is the story of the difficulties of being a prophet in a technological age, of a man who tried to use literary art to understand a scientific world, of a liberal humanist who believed in the selective breeding of humans, of a life that was for some just a trip from cynicism to mysticism, but for others charted the course from darkness to enlightenment.
Million spermatozoa, all of them alive. Out of their cataclysm, but one poor Noah dare hope to survive. And among that billion minus one might have chanced to be Shakespeare, another Newton, a new Donne. But the one was me.
Though no Shakespeare, Newton or Donne, this was no ordinary one. The seed contained the genes of Aldous's grandfather, Thomas Henry Huxley, the Victorian champion of Darwin's evolutionary theory. And the egg with which it was united carried the chromosomes of his great-uncle, Matthew Arnold, the humanist, poet, and defender of the arts. It was a legacy that set him apart from birth.
He simply, from very, very early on, had a passion for learning and a passion for knowing. And as a little boy, he used to sit and think. And but what was particular about him is not so much the inheritance, but something about him that made him quite extraordinary. I mean, I talked to people who are now no longer with us, who knew him when he was a little boy. And he said, it's not a word I carelessly used, there was an otherness about Aldous.
It was an accident of illness rather than birth that was to secure Huxley's sense of otherness. In 1911, when he was at Eton, he awoke one morning to find his eyes swollen and sore. His peculiar vision of the world was to be shaped by their subsequent deterioration.
And it left him for 1 year entirely blind. I mean, to the extent of having to walk with a guide. And he learned Braille. And it was quite uncertain whether he could ever see again.
I think the blindness was a crucial event in his life, coming when he was so young. And so far as he knew, not curable. One thing was that he was immensely courageous about it. It seems to me that to be able to face that ordeal and joke about it as he did, he said that the great advantage of blindness was that you could read in bed without getting your hands cold because you read Braille under the bedclothes. Anyone who could do that had got immense courage. But another thing I think that blindness did was, curiously, to not to switch him towards science, but to sharpen in some ways his interest in science, because the workings of the eye, exactly how the retina worked and so on, had been a very big thing, of course, in Darwinism. I mean, Darwin and Huxley both thought of the development of the eye as the great thing the evolutionists had to explain. So I think it sharpened his scientific interest in it. It gave a very personal feeling about science, and he was almost, as it were, an experiment in himself.
It's extraordinary what a lot of different modes of existence a thing has, when you come to think about it. And the more you think, the more obscure and mysterious everything becomes. What seemed solid vanishes. What was obvious and comprehensible becomes utterly mysterious. Look, it's just a shape that interrupts the light. To a child who has not yet learned to interpret what he sees, that's all it would be, just a shaped blotch of color. But now, suppose I try to consider the chemical way. These atoms, consisting of more or fewer electrons whizzing round a nucleus of greater or lesser charge, are atoms of different elements that build themselves up in certain architectural patterns into complicated molecules. Here are 2 ways already in which my hand exists. My hand moves like this. And it moves through your consciousness as well as here, across your skin. Universe lies on the top of universe, layer after layer, distinct and separate.
Well, the first thing that I think that drew him towards scientific ideas was that they provided an entirely new way of viewing the world, which was, to him, astonishingly exciting, and to many people in the early 20th century. A new way of viewing everything, really, as simple things. There's a scene, I think it's in Those Barren Leaves, where one of the characters, a girl, takes off a dress or takes off a jumper or something of this kind, and so she has bare arms. And he says that the warmth of her arms raised the surrounding temperature by 100 billionth of a degree. You know, that sort of view of the woman as a kind of heating coil was very new and interesting to him. And there's another bit where he's talking really about the First World War, which is a thing one mustn't leave out. The First World War, which changed a lot of people's notions of how much human feeling mattered and how you could view it with equanimity.
At this very moment, he went on, the most frightful horrors are taking place in every corner of the world. People are being crushed, slashed, disemboweled, mangled. Their dead bodies rot and their eyes decay with the rest. Screams of pain and fear go pulsing through the air at the rate of 1,100 feet per second. After traveling for 3 seconds, they're perfectly inaudible. These are distressing facts. But do we enjoy life any the less because of them? Most certainly we do not.
By the early 1920s, a new voice was emerging on the literary scene, chilling in its scientific observation of human cruelty, surgical in its dissection of modern morality. This was the voice that the young Huxley honed in what was to be his first adult home, Garsington Manor, a pacifist retreat set up by the society hostess, Lady Ottilie Morrell. It was here that he met the Belgian refugee Maria Nice, the woman who was to become his wife and guide, helping him find a way through an outside world he often found hard to navigate. Garsington was also a hothouse for his blossoming intellect, providing as it did sanctuary for the greatest minds of the age, D.H. Lawrence, Bertrand Russell, T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf.
It was certainly a refuge from the pain of the First World War. So many of the people he'd been at college with were being reported dead or missing. Here in the Oxfordshire countryside, he spent his days wood chopping, reading, making hay with Clive Bell, and he began to develop as a sort of literary man. And his reading begins to develop. He begins to read French symbolists and begins to review for the New Statesman and the Nation, and begins to project himself as a litterateur.
It was this world of writers and thinkers that inspired Aldous's first novel, Chrome Yellow, a work that instantly established his reputation as the voice of a generation disillusioned with the old world and frightened of the new.
Oh, I think it dazzled. You see, it was the what was then considered cynicism, the openness, the erudition, and it was new and it was just right, you know, it covered the immediate post-war period and then the early 20s, the later 20s, and anybody who was young and adolescent or growing up then, I mean, it was brilliant.
Yeah, I think cynicism is not exactly the right word, because I know what it means, that he seemed apart from human feelings, even to despise human feeling. I think there was something in Huxley that was very badly hurt early on. He seemed to despise human feeling and human beings altogether.
Despise them or not, Huxley certainly seemed to fear them in their multiplying masses, with their clamouring demands for political power. So strong was this fear that, like so many intellectuals of the 1920s, he championed eugenics, the theory that social harmony could only be achieved through selective breeding.
Huxley came from a time, and Huxley came from a family, that was very much concerned with human quality. The idea was that we could improve our machines, therefore we could improve our people. And if we didn't improve our people, then nature would inevitably take its course and we'd evolve into this terrible dystopia. I mean, most utopias, like Huxley's utopia, are in fact not nice places to live. Of course, they're terrible places to live. And being a very patrician individual, he felt, of course, that it was his duty, if only metaphorically, to do something about it. And in that, he was close to many of these scientists and the artists of his day who were clear, keen eugenicists, people who felt that they should do something to change the evolutionary future of the human species, something positive or something negative. H.G. Wells, of course, another great science fiction writer, was a passionate eugenicist. So was George Bernard Shaw. So was Winston Churchill. So, of course, was Adolf Hitler. So there was no split between left and right here.
I think that's really a measure of, though, his sense of heredity, his sense of the kind of genetic inheritance, that you had to kind of stamp out certain types if you were going to alter the social makeup. I don't think we should see him as a crypto-fascist at all. I mean, it's clearly an unpalatable view nowadays. But many people at the time saw eugenics as a way of fast-forwarding to a better future.
It's not only artificial reproduction, of course, it's controlled reproduction. That's taking away from the human being, as it were, the major function of reproducing the race, and putting it into the hands of scientists, of responsible people. And he wanted to do that, and he found that fascinating as an idea that avoided a great deal of human frustration and unhappiness, because what he wanted to do was to, as he says in Brave New World, was to create beings who were exactly adapted to their roles in life. So there would be no feeling of abilities that weren't used.
Brave New World captured the anxieties of an age overwhelmed by the first wave of mass consumption, depicting a population happily but helplessly enthralled by cheap thrills and mindless entertainment.
So I think he set himself out to paint a picture of mass happiness and how dreadful that was, because the things that made people happy were all, in his view, inferior to the high culture that he had been brought up to respect.
In 1931, as economies collapsed and political extremism flourished, Huxley became increasingly aware that it was mass misery rather than mass happiness that was the threat. According to research by his latest biographer, even as he was writing Brave New World, his famous vision of the future was becoming blurred.
It starts off as a satire on the global diffusion of American mores, the American way of life. The whole society is predicated on mass consumption, mass production. But I think the deep ambivalence in the book is that I think halfway through, literally halfway through writing it, he grew to doubt whether he wanted to write a satire on the American bogey. What he really wanted to write, I think, was a blueprint. But he sort of didn't quite have the nerve to do that either. So I think that, in a sense, his fear of the masses and his sense of wanting to do something for those masses, to radically alter British society, is reflected in the book.
This combination of fear and sympathy made it impossible for Huxley to line up behind either of the political poles of communism and fascism that were dividing the rest of the world. Instead, he turned to pacifism, in particular the almost mystical form practiced by his friend, the broadcaster and writer Gerald Heard.
Heard allowed Huxley's more alternative side to flourish. He became interested in pacifism because of Heard in November 1935. But it's interesting that when they're in the Peace Pledge Union, the other figures there, who essentially churchmen and sort of more solid, they became very disenchanted with Huxley and Heard, and the leader of it, Dick Shepherd, at one point says how Gerald Herdy Huxley is becoming.
He and his friends, particularly Gerald Heard, led it rather to extremes. I mean, they thought that if there was a war, what they should do would be to get between the two lines of the fascists and the anti-fascists, the French, I suppose, and the Germans would be, and sort of stand in their way. And they thought that this would either be a sort of a gesture, or it would be successful, and the combating sides would be shamed into not continuing the war. They were extreme, sort of pacifists in a Quaker kind of way.
They believed in meditation and sort of doing exercises which to encourage pacifism, whereas of course, you know, the average membership was just concerned with the threat of fascism.
Aldous was profoundly pessimistic. I mean, he thought of civilization ending up in total collapse. For Aldous, the means were supremely important, and therefore he was really against anti-fascism, in the sense that anti-fascism was certain to lead to world war. And he thought that if there was a world war and we fought fascism, because of the means that we would have to use in order to conquer fascism, we would become mirror images of the fascists whom we were fighting.
I think one of the basic problems is somehow to find means whereby the extraordinarily violent drives of our instincts and our emotions can be given expression without doing harm either to ourselves or to our neighbors. And this is something which I think that many earlier civilizations and many so-called primitive peoples have thought about.
Pacifism may not have saved the world from war, but it saved Huxley from creative paralysis. He felt inspired to finish Eyeless in Gaza, his story of a cynical man of leisure in search of enlightenment. It was to be his last substantial novel for nearly a quarter of a century, and took him 3 years to complete.
And then he finds an end to the book, which is total pacifism and trying to develop the spiritual self. It was a very painful transitional period. And then it was very gradual. I mean, after that, the next step was to leave Europe and be an unknown man in a very large new country.
The car plunged into a tunnel and emerged into another world, a vast, untidy suburban world of filling stations and billboards, of vacant lots and waste paper, and churches. Catholic churches like Canterbury Cathedral, synagogues disguised as Hagia Sophia, Christian Science churches with pillars and pediments like banks, eats, cocktails, open nights, jumbo malts, do things, go places with Consol's super gas. The car sped onwards. Astrology, numerology, psychic readings, drive-in for nut burgers, mile after mile interminably. Classy eats, mile-high cones. Jesus saves. Fine liquors. Go to church and feel better all the week. A real estate agent's office in the form of an Egyptian sphinx. Jesus is coming soon. Beverly Pantheon, the cemetery that is different. Past a Rosicrucian temple, past 2 cat and dog hospitals, past a school for drum majorettes. Sunset Boulevard, Beverly Hills. The surroundings changed. The road was flanked by the gardens of a rich residential quarter. Through trees, the facades of houses, all new, almost all in good taste. That's Harold Lloyd's place, said the chauffeur. And that's Charlie Chaplin's. Yes, sir.
This was to become Huxley's brave new world, America. In the late 1930s, he settled in California and found a new Garsington of talent and ideas. Charlie Chaplin, Igor Stravinsky, Orson Welles. There wasn't a famous name among California's new community that did not feature in his awesome address book.
Hollywood was Los Angeles was an ideal place at the time. Ideal in one way, because it was a place where you could hold fast to any idea, anything went. There were certainly no inhibitions and no ideas that you couldn't pursue. And it enjoyed the, how shall I say, the symbol of a country that had fought the war and contributed to the victory. It had, America, for those years, stood out as a land of hope.
As well as offering hope, California also offered exotic new ideas such as the Bates method, a treatment for his virtual blindness that stressed the therapeutic benefits of meditation and self-control over conventional medicine and surgery.
When we came in 1938 here in California, he went to see an oculist, and the oculist said, "Well, I'm sorry, Mr. Huxley, but I think you have to prepare yourself for being totally blind in about 3 or 4 years' time." And at the end, I have seen him read a micro Bible this big, about, 4 inches tall, or whatever it is, at 15 paces with a strong light. Now, he could no more do that than fly. But in that place, for the first time, he saw well enough. He said to my mother, "Let me try and drive." I said, "Of course." And there was a long stretch of about 30 miles dead straight. And we go up and down hills, slightly hilly. And he drove on it. Rather terrifying, because he drove me once that way. It wasn't good enough sight for that, but he knew the vague motions of it, and he enjoyed the speed. Clearly, I think, he wanted to put the foot on the accelerator. And my mother was saying, "Take it easy, Aldous."
Huxley's search for bright light and empty roads took him to Llano, a tiny community on the edge of California's Mojave Desert. It provided a welcome retreat, being far enough from Los Angeles for him to enjoy the solitude he needed to think and write, and close enough for him to pursue a tentative career as a Hollywood scriptwriter.
When he came out here, it was a wee little farmhouse with an orchard next to it, and quite isolated and alone, and that was one of the things that attracted him to living out here, the isolation for his writing. Another thing that interested him very much when he found out about it was the fact that in 1915 there was a socialist commune that was built out here, flourished for about 2 years. We have a remnant of it here in the back, the old water tower, probably built in 1915. And he wrote his books over here in his studio, which he built himself. It was the site of his writing The Art of Seeing. It also was where he wrote Time Must Have a Stop, which was his book about the transmigration of souls. And Huxley talked about his soul living on here. We have yet to see it, although one night at his studio we heard a rap, 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 rap on the door late at night, and we thought, it's Huxley, he's come back. But upon further investigation, we found a wood rat kicking the wall.
Yes, the desert, of course, has this extraordinary quality of silence, which is quite unlike anything that I know about. And, of course, this immense clarity and the expanse of the sky is something very extraordinary.
What I remember most was the way he spoke of the symbolic power of the desert. He said the emptiness of the desert emptied his own mind and made him think of the desert fathers and the nothingness that they would talk about. But of course that nothingness was not a literal nothingness, it was a no-thingness, because the barrenness of the desert spread a mantle of sameness over the particulars of the world in the way that snow can cover and bring out the underlying unity.
Though still a regular visitor to Europe, during the 1950s Huxley forged firmer links with his new home in America. In 1956, a year after the death of his first wife Maria, he married the musician and psychotherapist Laura Archera in a ceremony that seemed calculated to express the freewheeling spirit of Californian life.
He told me that he had seen that there were Marian Chapel. He had taken a trip in the summer, and he said that passing by, he saw that there were chapels where you could be married. And it was very interesting. And we thought both would be wonderful to escape all the ceremonies, and go there. And we took the car one night and we slept there, and then the next morning we went around one of these chapels. And it was very louche. I thought it was sinister. It seemed to me very sinister. But it wasn't, of course. It was just my imagination. And so we just were the two of us, and they said, well, where is your witness? And we had no witness. So the lady from the ladies' room was my witness, and then they picked up a man, and the whole thing was very quick.
Well, shall I say it came as a complete shock to me, the fact that he never even thought he might be remarried, and that I didn't even read it in the paper. Somebody told me it was in the paper, so I go buy a newspaper to find out that he was married. He then wrote me a letter saying, rather apologetically, I wish I had written you ahead of time, but it was the spur of the moment. I suppose it must have been, but it was curiously unhappy-making.
This was the period of Aldous' metamorphosis from cynic to mystic. Though elements of mysticism could be found in his earlier work, it was now in the ascendant. Encouraged by the success of the Bates method in improving his sight, he began to dabble in just about every alternative therapy and philosophy that came his way, from Dianetics to colonic irrigation.
He thought that Western medicine couldn't do everything. It was very limited, and again, bumptious. But he wanted to discover miraculous things. He longed for mystical experiences and felt that he himself was too arid. He was not a naturally religious man, but he thought that we could not survive by rationalism alone.
This was at the start of the influx of Asian spirituality into America. And, of course, then there's a question of one individual, Huxley, in this, but it is not insignificant the fact that this cluster of intellectuals there, looking affirmatively on wisdom from abroad, had a good part in opening the sluice gates, you might say, of Asian spirituality in the West.
He had studied the mystics. He has already written several books on that. And when he understood the possibility of chemical changes. Chemical changes can come through something that you ingest, or through fasting, through prayer. There is a chemical changes when we do anything. When we eat spaghetti, we change too, you know. So he was interested, and of course that was a very deep discovery, that this change could be brought about from a drug that is so small that it's invisible.
Since the early 1950s, he'd been experimenting with mescaline and LSD under the supervision of the British psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond. It was the results of these experiments that inspired Osmond to coin the term psychedelic and Huxley to write The Doors of Perception, the essay that inspired the creation of a whole new drug culture, and indeed the name of its leading rock band. Meanwhile, for his critics back in Britain, this was proof that having left the country, Huxley had finally taken leave of his senses.
I took my pill at 11. An hour and a half later, I was sitting in my study, looking intently at a small glass vase. The vase contained only 3 flowers: a full-blown Belle of Portugal rose, shell pink with a hint at every petal's base of a hotter, flamier hue, a large magenta and cream-colored carnation, and pale purple at the end of its broken stalk, the bold heraldic blossom of an iris. The little nosegay broke all the rules of traditional good taste. At breakfast that morning, I'd been struck by the lively dissonance of its colors. But that was no longer the point. I was not looking now at an unusual flower arrangement. I was seeing what Adam had seen on the morning of his creation. The miracle, moment by moment, of naked existence.
And he went into a beautiful place. It's all written up where he wrote to Humphrey Osmond a report on this. And he said, finally, you have to say those almost embarrassing words, God is love.
You know, when he thought that he had made the breakthrough through mescaline, through LSD, to some kind of ultimate reality. Well, for one thing, what was it like? He said in an interview that when you reach the ultimate mystical breakthrough, you discover that in some way, despite everything, the universe is all right. Well, you know, is it worth going that far to find out something like that? And the message was so platitudinous, and also the belief so illogical. Why should it be that you reach ultimate reality through mescaline or LSD rather than through, you know, having lumbago or toothache or any other kind of physical disturbance? You feel that the earlier Huxley would have disposed of such ideas in moments.
Well, I think the people who would benefit most of all are professors. And this, I think it would be extremely good for almost anybody with fixed ideas and with a great certainty about what's what. To take this thing and to realize that the world he has constructed is by no means the only world, that there are these extraordinary other types of universe which we may inhabit and which we should be very grateful for inhabiting, I think.
From the French window, I walked out under a kind of pergola, covered in part by a climbing rose tree, in part by laths. The sun was shining, and the shadows of the laths made a zebra-like pattern on the ground and across the seat and back of a garden chair, which was standing at this end of the pergola. That chair. Shall I ever forget it? Where the shadows fell on the canvas upholstery, stripes of a deep but glowing indigo alternated with stripes of an incandescence so intensely bright that it was hard to believe that they could be made of anything but blue fire. For what seemed an immensely long time, I gazed without knowing, even without wishing to know, what it was that confronted me. This succession of azure furnace doors, separated by gulfs of unfathomable gentian. It was inexpressibly wonderful, wonderful to the point almost of being terrifying. And suddenly, I had an inkling of what it must feel like to be mad.
His encouragement, in a way, of the use of drugs, relatively innocent in those days, was part of this desire to feed an appetite that wanted to understand phenomena, and that it wasn't. I wouldn't go as far as saying that he was experimenting with that, but he was just himself so often transported into a world illuminated by the greater understanding of the phenomena of nature, that he wanted everybody to share in that.
This urge to share was given an unexpected boost when Huxley found himself lecturing at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in 1960. Just down the road, Timothy Leary, the man who was to invite a generation to tune in, turn on and drop out, was hatching far more ambitious plans for psychedelic experimentation. These plans were to thrust what was then still seen as little more than an intellectual indulgence into the centre of the political stage.
I feel that any responsible adult who can demonstrate sociological acceptable reasons for using these drugs in his research, in his own personal spiritual life, in his self-growth, in his pursuit of knowledge or whatever, a person who is responsible and adult should be allowed to have a license so that he could use these substances.
When I found that he was just down the road, Massachusetts Avenue, with real trembling awe, I picked up the phone and called down there, and there was this man I idolized. And I explained to him what we were doing, and he said, now let me get this straight. You chaps over there at Harvard, you have authority to use psychedelic drugs and to research consciousness? And I said, yes, sir. He said, what's your address? I'm getting a cab, and I'll be there in 5 minutes.
It was a match made in nirvana, except that after just a few months of collaboration, Leary and his fellow adventurers began to head off in directions that Huxley found unacceptable. Aldous wanted LSD administered under controlled supervision. Leary, on the other hand, wanted to throw it into the Los Angeles water supply.
Aldous Huxley belonged to the classic European Eastern culture. It was very elitist. Not in the sense of class, but in the sense of they weren't running around trying to sign up applicants. We were Americans, and we were imbued with the American sense of, hey, this should be shared. I think he saw me as some crazed Irish poet that was getting out of hand here.
High winds and dry brush send a flash fire roaring through the elegant Hollywood Hills suburb in California. Residents and firemen worked together.
In 1961, the Huxley home in Deronda Drive was caught in one of the bushfires that periodically sweep through the Hollywood Hills.
Among the mansions destroyed is that of famed author Aldous Huxley. Into the next day, the ruins smolder, creating new danger that another rising wind might rekindle the flames.
And all of a sudden it was there. The flame did everything. And so I became sort of enchanted with that, and I wouldn't do anything. And then Aldous came downstairs and said, but we had to take something out. And so he took some suits, and I took 2 or 3 suits, and then he took Island, the manuscript of Island. He was working on that. Was the last chapter, in fact, which is the most beautiful. And I took my violin, and I took. It's very strange. Really, I don't know what happened to my mind. I took only the things that were insured. I left all the others in, and we went, and it was disastrous.
And when that went, kind of, not a part of him, but a memory of a part of him left. It was in a curious kind of way. Not that he was part of the object as an object, but part as a collector. Why did he pick up this rather nice cat, figure of a rather nice black pottery cat? 25 cents at a market in Mexico or something. Well, because it was pretty, and he liked it. It hit his eye, and he brought it back. Well, there's these kinds of memories which disappeared when his house disappeared.
It was a big thing, but probably not as big as might have been, because there was the relationship, there was health, and there was creativity, and all of that was important.
The book Laura had snatched from the flames was a vital work for Huxley. Island was his first full-scale novel after 2 decades devoted to writing essays on philosophy and drugs. It was to be a constructive vision of the future based on all he had learned in the recent past, a truly brave new world to rouse the timorous old one. Set on the imaginary tropical island of Pala, the novel imagined a post-industrial society that escaped the destructive inattentions of the mechanized world and instead celebrated a new balanced ecology of mind and body.
Well, it's a fantasy. It's a kind of reverse Brave New World about a society in which serious efforts are made to develop the potentialities of individuals to the full. It's an extremely difficult thing to write, because it's much easier to write about negative things than about positive.
This is an ideal picture.
It's an ideal, but I hope not a stratospheric ideal.
Everything that is written in Island is has a possible realization. It's not just fantasy. Those methods, those recipes have been already tried in different cultures, in different times. It's not just an imaginative society, it's a possible society.
To begin with, we never allowed ourselves to produce more children than we could feed, clothe, house, and educate into something like full humanity. Not being overpopulated, we have plenty. But although we have plenty, we've managed to resist the temptation that the West has now succumbed to, the temptation to overconsume. We don't give ourselves coronaries by guzzling 6 times as much saturated fat as we need. We don't hypnotize ourselves into believing that 2 television sets will make us twice as happy as 1 television set. And finally, we don't spend a quarter of the gross national product preparing for World War III.
Given the hydrogen bomb, we're obviously in imminent danger, and also given this kind of culture which causes us to spend an enormous proportion of our resources on the armament race, we are not going to be able to solve the ecological problem of man upon the earth. We are not going to be able to solve the problem of a species which is increasing at the rate of 50 million per annum on a limited environment. I mean, this is going to require all our goodwill and all our intelligence and all our knowledge.
Island was not a critical success. Like the polarized world it was rejecting, it too was divided, part novel, part pamphlet, part fiction, part fact. As with so much of his work, even his most celebrated, it was a cultural half-caste that couldn't find a home.
Island was badly received critically, and one can see why. The exposition dominates the book rather than plot. Anthony Burgess once said that Huxley equipped the novel with a brain. I think, by the time you get to Island, you sometimes feel that Huxley equipped the novel with a swami. And it sort of destabilizes it as a fiction.
At the end of his life, Huxley's hope of uniting the polarities of modern culture seemed to end up only emphasizing them. He was trying to bring together science and art, East and West, body and soul, intuition and ideas, using the very cultural forms that had helped keep them apart, the literary fiction that resisted documentary fact, the work of art that avoided intellectual analysis.
In a way, I think it's maybe it's slightly fraudulent, what my pretensions to be a novelist. Perhaps I really am an essayist who uses the novelistic form, but who enjoys it very much.
I think he's such a different kind of writer. Great writer is a difficult thing to say of him. I actually don't think that a writer who portrays human beings in quite so limited a way would, for me, be a great writer.
As a literary writer, I think he was not as good as whole spectrum of people thought when he was young, and he's not as bad as some of the critics thought. He himself gave it up almost deliberately, to improve as a writer, to give up art because he wanted to find out and try what to do his task was.
Personally, I see this as a virtue. That is, he didn't care. That wasn't the first thing in his life. I remember his remarking once, truth lies at the bottom of a very dirty well. And he was more interested in truth than he was in retaining any kind of a public image. And so for those of us in my generation and some older than myself, there's a very commanding presence in our century.
In 1962, soon after the publication of Island, Huxley was found to have a tumour on his neck. A year later, he was confined to his bed.
I knew that he was dying, but he didn't ever seem to want to talk about it. So I didn't force it, of course. But he knew then, just a few hours before. And he wrote a note, "If I go," he said. And then he said, he gave his own prescription. He said 100 microgram of LSD, intramuscular. And so I did. I gave him an injection, and he went very quietly. I spoke to him to let go and go on. And then he squeezed my hand at a certain point. It was still possible for him to squeeze my hand, but he had that expression that he took exactly when he was in a very static frame, in a static state. He had a wonderful expression in his face, and he went very, very, very easily, very quietly.
Reports of his death took some time to filter out, as that same afternoon, news broke in Dallas that President Kennedy had been assassinated. It was perhaps fitting that a life so concerned with explaining the modern age should have ended with one of its defining moments.